My friends, something important just happened with the Detroit Lions, and if you've been paying close attention to how this front office operates, this move tells you a lot more than it might seem at first glance. Because while a lot of fans are still waiting for that big splash, the reality is the Lions are quietly reshaping one of the most important units on this team, and it starts in the trenches. The Lions have officially brought in Ben Bartch, an interior offensive lineman with a very specific profile. He's 27 years old, around 315 pounds, originally drafted in 2020, and most recently coming from the San Francisco 49ers. On paper, his numbers don't jump off the page immediately. Limited snaps, some inconsistency, but once you dig deeper, you start to understand what this move is really about. Bartch has dealt with injuries throughout his career, and that's been the biggest reason why he hasn't fully stabilized as a long-term starter. There was a stretch where he started 11 games and looked like he could lock down a guard position, but then a dislocated knee completely changed his trajectory. After that, he had another opportunity, struggled, got benched, and eventually moved on. Even with the 49ers, he showed flashes, appearing in multiple games but never fully staying healthy long enough to cement his role. So why bring him in now? Because this isn't about finding a guaranteed starter. This is about competition, depth, and upside. And that's something Brad Holmes has been extremely consistent about. The Lions are building a roster where every position group is pushed, where nobody is comfortable, and where depth isn't just a backup plan, it's part of the strategy. And when you look at the current interior offensive line room, it makes even more sense. You already have names like Cade Mays and Tate Ratledge expected to compete for starting roles, and then behind them, there's a crowded group fighting for that final guard spot. Players like Juice Scruggs, Christian Mahogany, and others are all in that mix. Adding Bartch doesn't guarantee anything, it just raises the level of competition. But here's the part that really ties this move together. The Lions didn't just add someone, they also lost someone. Kyoto Wasika, who had been a reliable backup on this roster, is now heading to the Los Angeles Chargers. He wasn't a star, but he was dependable, and in a system like Detroit's, that matters. So this isn't just a random signing, it's a direct replacement in terms of depth, with a player who arguably has a higher ceiling if he can stay healthy. And that brings us to the bigger picture. This is exactly what the Lions are doing in this phase of the offseason. They're not forcing big, risky moves. They're taking calculated swings. They're adding players with upside at a lower cost, understanding that they have more needs than available money. And according to league analysis, that approach is actually being viewed as smart roster building, taking chances on players who could outperform their contracts rather than overpaying for certainty. At the same time, there's still one glaring question that hasn't been answered yet, and every fan knows exactly what it is: the edge position. Even with additions like DJ Wonnum, there's still a feeling that the Lions are missing that true, reliable presence opposite Aiden Hutchinson. Wonnum looks more like a complementary piece, a rotational player, maybe a number 3 option, but not necessarily the guy you want as your definitive starter on the other side. And that's where the tension is building, because while the Lions have done a solid job adding depth and value across the roster, fans are still waiting for that one move that changes the dynamic of the defense. Someone who can consistently pressure the quarterback, disrupt plays, and make life easier for the secondary. Someone who offenses actually have to game plan around. Right now, that piece isn't here yet. And if you listen closely to how Brad Holmes is approaching this, it doesn't sound like panic. It sounds like patience. The kind of patience that suggests this move might not come in free agency at all. It might come later. So now let me ask you this, because this is where it gets really interesting. Are the Lions making the right call by building depth first and waiting on that major edge move, or are they taking too big of a risk by not addressing it immediately? Because if you follow that line of thinking a little further, it starts to feel less like the Lions are delaying a move, and more like they already know exactly where that answer is coming from, and everything points to the draft. When Brad Holmes spoke recently, there was a very clear tone in how he addressed both the offensive line and the edge position. It wasn't vague, it wasn't uncertain, it was calculated. The Lions are not entering this next phase guessing. They've already mapped out multiple scenarios, and the way this roster has been constructed so far is setting up those next decisions. Let's start with the offensive line, because this is where things get even more telling. There's a growing belief internally that the Lions are going to address the offensive tackle position early, potentially with their first round pick. And when you really think about it, it makes perfect sense. You don't invest heavily in a quarterback like Jared Goff and then leave questions around his protection. That's not how this front office operates. That's not how this team has been built over the last few seasons. There's been some outside noise suggesting that current options on the roster could step into bigger roles, but the reality is the Lions don't seem comfortable relying on that long term. Instead, they're looking at this draft class as an opportunity to secure a cornerstone piece, someone who can anchor that line for years to come, and that also explains why some of the current players are better suited for depth roles rather than being forced into starting positions. The Lions value versatility, but they also value stability, and if they can get both through the draft, they're going to take that route without hesitation. Now shift back to the defensive side, because this is where the real anticipation is building. Even with DJ Wonnum in the mix, there's no real indication that the Lions view him as the final answer opposite Aiden Hutchinson. In fact, everything suggests the opposite. He's a piece, not the piece. And that distinction matters a lot. There's a strong possibility the Lions target an edge rusher in the second round, or even maneuver around the board to get the right value. And that word, value, keeps coming up for a reason. This front office is not chasing names. They're chasing fit, upside, and long-term impact. And here's where it gets even more interesting. There's also the possibility that the Lions double down at the position. When you look at the current depth chart, it's clear there's room for more than just one addition. Bringing in one young pass rusher doesn't necessarily solve the entire problem, but bringing in two, now you're talking about creating real competition, real rotation, and potentially uncovering a breakout player that changes everything. And that's before you even consider the alternative paths, because the draft isn't the only option here. There are still veteran players available who often wait until after the draft to sign, once they have a clearer picture of their opportunities. There are also potential trade scenarios that could develop depending on how other teams evaluate their own rosters after adding rookies. That means the Lions are keeping flexibility, not committing too early, not locking themselves into one solution, and that patience might end up being their biggest advantage. Now, while all of this is happening, there's another layer to this strategy that hasn't gone unnoticed, and it might actually be the most important piece of the entire puzzle. The Lions are preparing financially for the future, specifically for one draft class that has already proven to be foundational for this team. We're talking about players like Jahmyr Gibbs, Jack Campbell, Sam Laporta, and Brian Branch. The intention is clear. They want to keep all four. Not just for now, but for the long haul. And that requires planning. That requires discipline and free agency. That requires passing on certain moves today so you can secure your core tomorrow. And if you think about it, that explains everything we've seen. The measured signings, the focus on depth, the lack of overpaying, the patience at premium positions. It's all connected. This isn't a team that's unsure of its direction. This is a team that knows exactly who it wants to be and is making sure it can sustain that identity for years, not just one season. So when fans look at the current roster and feel like something is still missing, they're not wrong. There is still a piece that needs to be added, but the Lions don't seem concerned about when that piece arrives. They're focused on how it fits when it does. And that's a very different mindset. Now everything comes down to execution. The draft, potential late free agency moves, possible trades. This next stretch is going to define how complete this roster really is heading into the season. And that's where this entire situation starts to come into focus in a way that not every fan is fully seeing yet, because it's not just about adding one player. It's about how all these decisions connect and shape what this team is going to look like when it actually steps on the field. If the Detroit Lions follow through with this plan, what you're going to see is a roster that's deeper, more flexible, and built to withstand a full season, not just flash early and fade. And that matters, because one of the biggest challenges for any contender isn't just talent, it's durability across 17 games and beyond. Think about what they've already done. They reinforced the interior offensive line with Ben Barch as a depth piece, replacing Kayode Awosika while potentially raising the overall ceiling of that backup unit. They added rotational value on the defensive edge with DJ Wonnum, even if he's not the final answer. And most importantly, they avoided making desperate moves that could hurt them financially when it's time to pay their core players. Because let's be real, keeping this young core together is the real priority. When you have players like Jahmyr Gibbs, Jack Campbell, Sam Laporta, and Brian Branch all trending toward long-term deals, every dollar you spend right now matters. Overpay in one area, and suddenly you're making tough decisions later. And that's exactly what this front office is trying to avoid. Now here's the part that should actually excite Lions fans. If they hit on the draft the way they believe they can, especially at offensive tackle and edge, this roster doesn't just stay competitive, it takes another step forward. You're talking about adding young, cost-controlled talent at premium positions while still maintaining one of the strongest offensive identities in the league. And that brings us back to Jared Goff. Everything they're doing protects him. Everything. From reinforcing the offensive line, to maintaining a strong run game, to making sure the defense can generate pressure and get the ball back. This isn't random roster building, it's a system designed to maximize what this team already does well. But there's still that one variable, execution, because we've seen teams with great plans fall apart if they miss on key draft picks, or if the expected breakout players don't develop. And in this case, the Lions are putting a lot of weight on what happens next, on identifying the right edge rusher, on solidifying that offensive line for the future, and on making sure their depth actually translates when injuries inevitably hit. And don't forget, there are still paths outside the draft. A trade could change everything overnight. A post-draft free agent signing could fill that remaining gap. This front office has left the door open for multiple outcomes, and that flexibility might end up being the difference between a good roster and a complete one. So when you step back and look at the full picture, this isn't a passive offseason, it's a controlled one. The Lions are choosing patience over panic, structure over splash, and long-term stability over short-term headlines. The real question is whether that approach is going to pay off when it matters most. Because if they get this right, you're looking at a team that's not just trying to compete, you're looking at a team that's built to stay in the conversation for years. But if they miss on that one key addition, especially at edge, it could be the one thing that holds this defense back from reaching its full potential. And that's exactly why this next phase might end up defining not just this season, but the direction of the Detroit Lions for the next few years. Because everything they've done up to this point has been about setting the table for what comes next. You can already see the structure in place. They didn't panic in free agency. They didn't overspend. They added pieces like Ben Barch to reinforce depth. They replaced Kyoto Wosika without disrupting the balance of the roster. And they brought in a rotational edge like DJ Wanham while keeping their options open for something bigger. None of these moves were designed to win headlines. They were designed to give them flexibility. And now, all of that flexibility points directly to the draft and what happens immediately after it. Because this is where Brad Holmes has built his reputation. Finding value, identifying talent that fits the system, and making moves that don't always look obvious in the moment, but make perfect sense over time. That's how this roster was built, and that's why there's a level of trust, even if there's still some impatience from the fan base. Now imagine this scenario for a second. The Lions go into the draft, address the offensive tackle position early, exactly like it's been hinted. That immediately stabilizes protection for Jared Goff long term. Then, instead of forcing a pick at edge too early, they stay disciplined, find value in the second round or through a trade back, and land a pass rusher who fits their scheme perfectly. Now suddenly, that missing piece everyone's been talking about starts to take shape, and if they double down at the position like it's been suggested, now you're not relying on one player, you're building a rotation, you're creating competition. You're giving your defensive line multiple ways to win instead of depending on a single name to carry